Let me pray and then officially announce what we're doing today. Father, we thank you for this time this afternoon where we can hold a class on biblical counseling, or sometimes called nouthetic counseling, or just simply discipleship of how we can be equipped to come alongside one another and help each other in our life struggles. So it is an afternoon of many things already done. Church and lunch, and so help us just to stay awake, to be alert, and to capture everything that's being said here. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Well, as I mentioned this morning, we've moved from an introduction, and when we talked about anxiety a couple weeks ago, to today, we're going to begin talking about depression. As I looked over my notes and books, I have heaps of stuff. And as you would expect, there's so much stuff out there on depression because there's a lot of depressed people out there. Even Christians. Christians are not impervious to depression. You probably know some famous people. I mean, Spurgeon was riddled with depression. William Cowper was riddled with depression. So you're not alone. If at times you have quote-unquote bouts of depression. The question is, well, how do we deal with it? One, how does the world deal with it? And two, as Christians, how do we deal with it? Or how should we deal with it? It's a big discussion, and as I said, we're not going to finish it today. So count on this being part one. There'll be at least a part two. Whether it be a part three, I don't know yet. But this is part one. In your notes, just a place to begin is some recommended reading. You need to know up front, as you know, I am a pastor. I'm not a scholar. I don't have a PhD in biblical counseling. I'm not a professor. So I'm the recipient of the teaching of others that have gone through and studied it a lot more. I was at Master's Seminary. And in Master's Seminary, we would take classes on biblical counseling. If you went over to the Master's University, you could get a degree in biblical counseling. You could get a master's degree in biblical counseling. So there's a depth of the information and understanding that's out there, and I might not be at that point. So I'm just, as I said, the recipient of everything that I've read, everything that I've been taught, everything that I've even listened to, and I'm turning around and giving it to you. And so in that sense, just be mindful of that and be nice to me with knowing that, as well as realize that everything I'm saying to you is not novel. It's out there in the books, it's out there in the sermons and the classes. And so I'm just the facilitator, as it were, in giving this to you. But it does come with conviction. I do believe everything I'm about to tell you, okay? Now, there's tons of books, as I said. Here's just a listing of some books, and some of the books I'm actually quoting throughout the class. Ed Welch has written a very good book called Depression, A Stubborn Darkness. This book and any book by Ed Welch I would get. He's with the CCEF, Christian Counselors Education Foundation. I think that's what it's called, in Philadelphia, connected to Westminster Seminary. So that's a think tank as it relates to biblical counseling. You remember Dave Pallison came out of there, Ed Welch, who's still there, I believe, and so a number of other names that are related to biblical counseling. That's all they do. They do counseling, but they also write books to help us in our own counseling. And this is a helpful book. And as I said, get any other book by him. Included this other one, Blame It on the Brain. Blame It on the Brain. That's what the Word wants to do. You got issues. It's not your life situation. It's not your life circumstances. It's not what you may or may not have. You got issues with your brain. So they want to see an organic issue with it. And that's not always the case. As we'll see, depression can be a spiritual issue. And obviously that's why we turn the Bible to say what it says spiritually. For those who are coming in, do we have any extra notes for these guys? Come on in. Yeah, just grab some notes and grab a seat. Ed Welch has also written a little booklet called Depression, The Way Up When You're Down. So if you can't be bothered reading the whole book, grab the booklet. Jay Adams, we mentioned his name last time, who's kind of the godfather of biblical counseling. He's written a book which it covers everything. So go to that chapter where he deals with depression, which is chapter 23. He's also written a booklet as well called What Do You Do When You Become Depressed? Have any of you read Donald Whitney's Spiritual Disciplines of the Christian Life? Just out of interest. When I first arrived in seminary, we would be divided into groups of 10 and have what we call a discipleship lab. One of the professors would meet with us every, Thursday afternoon, just to make it all real. I mean, you're in theology class and it's all academic, but, give us a bit of a pastoral guiding. That was the purpose of the class. And so we, as a class, or as a discipleship lab, decided to read, because it just came out, Donald Whitney's Disciplines of the Christian Life. I think that would have been either the fall or the spring of 1989. I'm dating myself here. A long time ago, still a classic. I would encourage you to get that book. If you want to know how to exercise yourself for godliness, how to discipline yourself for godliness, what are some of the spiritual disciplines? That's what the book is all about. Each chapter is listing a spiritual discipline. And so, hence why I recommend it. It's not about depression, but it is useful, as I say here, to instruct ourselves and those suffering from depression. When you're depressed, you don't feel like doing anything. Maybe you don't know what to do. Well, here's a list of things to do by way of spiritual disciplines. Justin Taylor and John Piper, they had a conference a number of years ago, as they always have a conference, Desiring God Conference, and sometimes those conferences come out with a book. Well, that conference came out with a book, and that book's titled Suffering and the Sovereignty of God. Worth getting. Multiple authors do that, so it's an edited work. And John Piper himself has written a book called When the Darkness Will Not Lift. If you know anything about his ministry is about, Christian hedonism, which not the greatest title, but I get what he means. He gets a lot of flack for that, but if you understand what he means, I'm okay with it. And what he means by that is that the Christian life should be a life of joy. The Christian life should be a life of happiness and peace. I think, he kind of rewrote the first question of the catechism. The question is, what is the chief end of man? And we know it's to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And he said, no, it's glorifying God by enjoying Him forever. So he just switches the preposition there, by enjoying Him forever. And I get that. But he also realizes that that's a struggle for most of us. Keeping that joy, keeping that peace, keeping that happiness, because life comes in and we do get discouraged and ultimately we do get depressed. And so this whole book is, how do we fight for it? How do you fight for it? Now, speaking of fight, let me put something here that, if I may say, is a bit novel. I haven't read this in any book, so this is probably the only thing that actually comes from me, per se. And this was, and I said it this morning in the announcements, this is something that, I don't know, I just sat down and thought about. Maybe this is self-reflective. Maybe this is a bit of a testimony. But you notice, in terms of how we feel, there's degrees of feeling. Someone who says, I'm depressed, might mean I'm just really discouraged and I'm downcast. Or I'm disappointed, I'm a bit depressed by that. So I thought, well, depression isn't for everybody. There's levels of being down. There's levels of being, of being miserable, for lack of a better term. So this is what I came up with. You first realize that feeling bad normally comes because you're disappointed about something. Maybe there's an expectation that wasn't met. Maybe there's a legitimate trial that came in your life that makes you feel sad. You lose a loved one, you are going to feel sad. That's normal. There's natural sadness. And in one sense, this whole discussion of depression actually should come back around to asking that question. Whatever happened to sadness? Because people who are sad sometimes are diagnosed as depressed. I mean, in the Bible, you have people that are sad. You have lament psalms. You know, psalms that are written by the psalmists who are in a particular situation where they're just sad. Disappointments can bring sadness. A disappointment then, if, depending on what it is, can also bring discouragement. Discouragement, as you can see there, possibly can lead to being downcast. And I would say that in itself, we see a lot of that in the Psalms. Psalm 42, Psalm 43, talks, the psalmist talks to himself, why are you in he says despair, but the actual idea is, why are you down? Why are you down, O my soul? That's pretty much where everybody gets at when there's a level of depression, or at least they think there's a level of depression. What they confuse depression with is being downcast. They're just down. If that's not checked, and what I mean by checked, if there's not some action on your part to deal with that, that'll then spiral down to what I have here is despondency. Everybody know what despondency means? You're just despondent. You don't know anymore. Why should I do this? Why should I do that? I don't know what the meaning of life is anymore. I don't know what the purpose of life is anymore. I put it in bold because I did a sermon series years ago, and I tried to find it. I couldn't find it. This was when I was handwriting all my sermons. Now I type it all out, but there was first 10 years I'd handwrite everything, and so if I don't keep it, it's gone somewhere. But I did a 4 or 5 part series on what I titled Fighting Despondency, or the War on Despondency. The war on despondency, because I see this as the very point that if you've gotten to this point, you've got to absolutely stop yourself and start fighting for it, to use John Piper's words. Get out of it now, because it can get worse. And in my language, and the way I would put it, if it's not fought and it does spiral down, then it becomes depression. And if that's not fought and you don't come out of depression and that continues to spiral down, then we're in the category of being in despair. And despair means no hope at all. I mean, you didn't have any hope in depression, and you probably didn't have any hope in despondency, but we are at DEFCON 5 now, where you want to kill yourself. That's despair, right? You know people like that? No, people who are just, what is the point? And they jump off a bridge, or they hang themselves. You don't want to wait till you get to the despair, do you? And I would say you don't even want to get to the point of depression. You don't even want to get to the point of despondency, but if you do get to at that point and you recognize you're at that point, get out of it quick. Make a war with despondency. And as Christians, we have the equipment to do that, as we'll see. Okay? Now, if you read the Puritans were big on this as well, but they didn't necessarily call it depression. They called it, anybody know the term they used? Melancholy. Melancholy. I think melancholy, depression would probably be too strong of a word to make the equation with melancholy. I think despondency or even downcast is what they meant by melancholy. But they recognized it as well. There's people, even Christians, who just feel blah because of life situations. So how do we deal with this? Well, let's first talk about, before we talk about what the Bible says, let's first talk about what the world says. Are you all familiar with a book called DSM, the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual? It's been through a number of editions. There's, I think it's up to its 5th edition. I just quote here the 4th because the 5th edition is no different than the 4th. But the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, which is known as DSM, is written by psychiatrists, it's written by psychologists. So they're putting a book together that says this is the symptom and this is what it's called. And thus this is the solution. So this is from the world. So according to the DSM-4, a manual used to diagnose mental disorders, depression occurs when you have at least 5 of the following 9 symptoms at the same time. Here's what they list. A depressed mood during most of the day, particularly in the morning, fatigue or loss of energy almost every day, feelings of worthlessness or guilt almost every day, impaired concentration, indecisiveness, insomnia or hypersomnia, excessive sleeping, markedly diminished interest or pleasure in almost all activities nearly every day. You just don't feel like doing anything. Recurring thoughts of death or suicide. And we're not talking about just fearing death. How do I get out of this place? You start fantasizing, what if I took, a whole bunch of pills? What if I jumped off a bridge? Or what if I found a gun and shot myself in the head? When that becomes a reoccurring thought, you're in a very bad place. A sense of restlessness, known as psychomotor agitation. The idea is that you're slowing down. You don't feel like eating, and therefore you're going to lose significant weight loss. Now, if you counted yourself up 5 out of those 9, you're depressed. Okay? Here's some just reflections on all of that. First of all, this is changing in thinking, not in the behavior. That's one thing I'll mention now in case you start dozing off and you fall asleep. The emotions are working fine. You feel bad. God's given us emotions. Something bad happens and you feel bad. That's normal. You got that? That's what I said earlier. Sadness is normal. Grief is normal. The issue always will be how you react to that problem. Do you react biblically or unbiblically? That will be the dividing line of whether you aren't depressed or you become depressed. Does that make sense? So the issue is thinking. As a man thinks in his heart, what? So is he, the proverb says. Look at number 3. And if you want a full explanation of what I'm about to see, go read that book I mentioned earlier by Ed Welch, Blame It on the Brain. Because even to this day, it's amazing. Even to this day, and for years this is what has been said, you walk into your doctor's office and you say, I'm depressed, and he gives you this little checklist, and yep, you're depressed. You tick, 5 of the 9 or 9 of the 9 or whatever else that's listed on the survey. Why are you depressed? Well, they might ask you some questions, but in the end, the number one reason why you are depressed is because you have a chemical imbalance in your brain. Anybody heard that before? Anybody been told that before? I'm here to tell you that's a theory. It's never been proven. There's actually no way you can test that. Even if you wanted to say that, there's nothing factual that is based upon. That's psychologists and psychiatrists that say, we don't know why you're depressed, so it must be on your brain, it must be organic, and there must be some kind of a chemical imbalance in your brain. And here's some pills to fix all that. Any doctor with any integrity at all will tell you there's no such thing as chemical imbalance. You got that? There's no such thing as chemical imbalance. People have been duped forever and given maybe the right diagnosis in that depressed, but the wrong solution. And the wrong solution is, well, you got a chemical imbalance. Now, on the heels of that, if you went to the website WebMD, you'll find some other things that will excuse, if I can say it that way, depression. Biology. We still don't know exactly what happens in the brain when people become depressed. But studies show that certain parts of the brain don't seem to be working normally. Depression might also be affected by changes in the levels of certain chemicals in the brain called neurotransmitters. They have to say that. We don't know for certain, but maybe this is what happens. Maybe it is chemical imbalance. So it could be a biological issue. How about a genetical issue? Researchers know that if depression runs in your family, you have a higher chance of becoming depressed. I'm reading a book that just came out, written by a pastor, published by a Christian publisher. And just to be fair, I haven't finished the book, but so far I'm not impressed. He's had major issues with anxiety his whole life. But when he found out that his grandmother had anxiety, aha! It's genetic. He still has a bout with anxiety, but now he knows the reason why he has anxiety. It's because, let's blame it on grandma and her genes. And we talked about anxiety a couple weeks ago. Anxiety or even depression is not genetic. Now, can I say this before I forget? Your personality might not help when it comes to depression. Some personalities do beat themselves up a bit more than others. Some personalities will keep them down a little bit longer than others. Not to do the whole personality, test or anything, but you know what I'm talking about. And in fact, one of the first things you want to know in dealing with depression is know yourself. Know yourself. In other words, if you, I used to counsel young men this way. They just broke up with their girlfriend and they're pretty hurt by it all and they're pretty, quote unquote, depressed by it all. Well, know yourself. Maybe don't watch, a movie it's a romantic movie. That probably won't help. Maybe don't turn on, love songs from the 80s at, 9 o'clock at night. Don't put yourself in a place where you know yourself that it's just going to make you more miserable. Does that make sense? So know yourself. Know your personality. Those are reasons but not excuses for being depressed. Okay? But it's certainly not genetics. Some studies, and again, this is the world's answer, some say that it's gender. Studies show that women are about twice as likely as men to become depressed. No one knows why. Perhaps the hormonal changes. Could be a number of reasons. Maybe, you will see a little bit later. Maybe it's because there's all this pressure from the feminist movement to say that you shouldn't be at home. You shouldn't be just looking after your children. You should be out there and making a career of yourself. And then when you are at home and you get all that pressure, it might make you depressed. Who knows? Or maybe just at home, maybe this not even the pressure from the feminist movement, but just at home all day by yourself with 2 or 3 screaming kids, that will make you depressed. Maybe that's a reason. I don't know. Again, reasons but not excuses. Age. People who are elderly are at higher risk of depression. Just go read Ecclesiastes 12. Remember Ecclesiastes 12? He says, remember your Creator in the day of your youth, because there's going to be a day, and he go and read it. He gives you all these pictures of what old age is. The knees start wobbling, the teeth start falling out, the ears can't hear, the hair's gone, the strength is gone. You could be depressed getting old. Health conditions such as cancer, heart disease, thyroid problems, chronic pain, and many other increase your risk of being depressed. Trauma and grief, of course, changes in stressful events, perhaps medication, substances. One thing they don't mention here, and I think it'll come up a bit later, is one of the first things I ask when people come and say, this is how I feel, before I even get to asking perhaps, is there a particular issue, I ask, how's your sleep going? How's your sleep going? Have you been getting a good night's sleep? Because if you're not getting a good night's sleep, it can affect your mood. It can affect the mood swings. In other words, there can be, and listen to me carefully, there can be some physical and organic reasons for people being depressed. If it's not sleep, having a brain tumor can perhaps cause mood swings. So in one sense, before you go down the spiritual route, and maybe you question them whether, man, really is it a spiritual problem here? Maybe there's something else. Send them to the doctor. Have the doctor do a blood check if necessary. Have them do a brain scan. But if nothing comes back with the blood work, nothing comes back with the brain scan, and they are getting a decent amount of sleep, in fact, they're sleeping all day, then perhaps it's a spiritual issue. Remember in the end of James 5, if you are sick, if any of you are sick, call the elders, right? Why call the elders? I mean, if you're sick, you call a doctor. But why call, and there it's physical sick, not a spiritual sick. If you're physically sick, call the elders. And of course, as I said, you look at that and you go, well, why call the elders? Call the doctor. That's because perhaps it is a spiritual issue that's making you physically sick. Call the elders because the elders are the elders because they're the most spiritually mature to discern whether it's a spiritual issue or not. And what is on the heels of that discussion in James 5? Confess your sins to one another. Maybe you're physically sick. It's because spiritually you've been bottling up unconfessed sin and guilt, and that'll make you miserable, as we'll see. Let's just, before we define depression, go to page 3. Let's describe depression. Here's Ed Welch. It is a pitiless, unrelenting pain that affords no window of hope, no alternative to a grim and brackish existence, and no respite from the cold undercurrents of thought and feeling that dominate the horribly restless nights of despair. He quotes Abraham Lincoln in his book. This is Abraham Lincoln. I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would be no one cheerful face on earth. Whether I shall even be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode I shall not. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better, it appears to me. Again, many could say the same thing. Maybe you can say the same thing at times. I mean, I can tell you there's times where I can lie in bed and think, just in that day, all the things I should have done and I didn't do, and all the things that I did do and I shouldn't have done, or, vice versa. All the things I might have said to the kids, all the things I said to my wife. And that can go beyond just that day, to the week, to the months. I literally, I could sit there and think of all those things that just absolutely make me depressed. And you get a bit of a window on depression. It comes from wrong thinking. Let's move on with some other descriptions. Jim Conway says, at work, this is a depressed man. He sits and stares at his papers, or he idly watches his machine work. He seems to do his job only if he is prodded by someone else. He isn't thinking about anything in particular. He just feels useless and depressed. His productivity fails. He loses the capacity for creative thinking. He is short-tempered with everyone. People who work under him say he is very difficult to please, and he's always finding small things wrong with the way they are doing the job. At home, he seems to have dropped out as well. Sometimes he simply sees a chair staring out the window, or listens endlessly to music, or watches television. He avoids conversation. He dodges leadership and problem solving. His temper flares and tells his wife and children, I just want to be left alone. Can't you understand that? Depression spills over into social relationships. He explains to his wife that he doesn't want to be with people. Just wants to escape. Nothing holds any interest. You are barely a walking zombie. Everything is drab, lifeless, and tired. Why work? Why get out of bed? Why do anything? Nothing seems to matter. This is depression. You can see what I mean by the difference between discouragement, downcast, despondency, and then get to this point. Very few of us probably get to this point. Maybe we do, But most of us, when we describe ourselves being depressed, we're more in the despondency or downcast spot. Depression, let's move on, says, has a logic of its own. Once it settles in, it can't distinguish between a loving embrace, the death of a close friend, and the news that a neighbor's grass is growing. Proverbs 18:14, the spirit of a man can endure his sickness, but as for a broken spirit, who can bear it? Someone who's depressed feels, and again, that's the key word, he feels. What does he feel? He feels hopeless. There's no hope. That's why as biblical counselors, and again, just to remind you, I'm equipping you to be a biblical counselor. One, to learn how to counsel yourself, but also to equip you to counsel somebody else. And the first thing that you need to give that counselee is what? Hope. Especially as a Christian, and even if he's non-Christian, but certainly as a Christian. Give them hope, because he feels hopeless. He's wanting to escape. He's in fact wanting to die. Now, those are some descriptions. We could say more about that. But what about a definition? Here's just a couple definitions by J. Adams. Depression, and I'm very encouraged by these because it goes back to my whole progression of depression when he says this. Notice what he says. Depression is a cyclical process in which the initial problem is mishandled in such a way that it is enlarged, notice, in downward spirals that eventually plunge one into despair. So you move from what? Disappointment all the way down to despair. The downward cycle, he says, enslaves one in hopelessness and guilt, thus bringing a slowing down or cessation of activity called depression. Now, just to begin with, let me give you 3 biblical examples of depression. You remember what's going on with Cain. Let's turn in our Bibles to Genesis 4. Just quickly, maybe we'll just look at the first 2 and then move on to the rest. But you remember the story with Cain and Abel. So there's Cain, there's Abel. They're bringing their offerings unto the Lord. Abel, his offering was received. Cain's sacrifice offering was rejected. That's in verses 3 to 4. And you notice Cain's response in verse 5, where God did not respect Cain and his offering. And then it says, and Cain was very angry and his countenance fell. There was something noticeable about Cain where you could tell that something was wrong. You say, well, he's got anger issues, Todd. He's not depressed. Well, you need to know that depression is somewhere between anger and apathy. It normally actually begins with anger. You're angry at what happened. And that then becomes a spiraling down to depression. First begins with disappointment. And if you understood disappointments, you understood the providence of God, you understood that everything happens in the, as we discussed in the catechism this morning, can God do anything? Can God do everything? Absolutely. He does everything according to his good pleasure. And your life is in his hands. And if disappointments come into your life, they've come from him. Remember what we say. It's not disappointment, but his appointment, right? So if you understand the providence of God, it's okay to be disappointed, but you quickly move on from that because your thinking changes to, well, that's God's will. You're not indifferent. You're not flippant towards it. So you accept it. You're submitting to it. But when you kick against it, and you don't like it, and you're angry about it, normally you're not angry about the situation. You're angry about the one who worked it all out for you, and that's God. And that's who he's angry with. He's angry with God, and his countenance is falling. And in many respects, he's depressed. So God, being the biblical counselor here, what does he say to him? Well, before the solution, notice what I said just a second ago, that he had certain expectations that should have been met. Divine approval, equality, superiority to his brother. I mean, how come he got, God accepted his and not mine? Made him angry, made him depressed. So as I say, God comes along. Notice in verse 7, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, here it is. Sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you shall rule over it. In other words, do you want to feel better? You want to move out of this anger, out of this depression? Well, deal with it. Fight against it. Deal with the sin. Rule over it. Master it. Fight for it. Whatever word you want to use there. And listen, if you don't master it, guess what? It will master you. You got that? Christian life is think of all the word pictures, the analogies that the New Testament uses of what a Christian is. A Christian is a what? He's a soldier. I mean, there's the farmer imagery, there's the athlete imagery, but another imagery is that he is a soldier. He is at war. And you say, oh, he's at war with the enemy out there, the world, the devil. Yeah, but he's also at war with the what? The flesh. We're at war with the flesh, and you better master it. You better get a handle on your emotions. Better start thinking correctly. Start disciplining the mind. Think on these things that are true. Another example, of course, is 1 Kings. Go over to 1 Kings. And you probably know this story with Elijah. Elijah was depressed. In fact, you could say he got down to despair because he wanted to die. You remember that? In 1 Kings chapter 19. And then there was no reason for, can I just say up front, there was no reason for Elijah to be depressed, because in 1 Kings 18, what goes on in 1 Kings 18? 1 Kings 18, he has this, what we might call a spiritual victory. This is, the Mount Carmel encounter, right? He brings all of Israel up on Mount Carmel, and he brings them up to have a showdown. Who is God? Is it Yahweh? Who is the Lord? Yahweh, or is it Baal? Because Israel's got 1 foot with the Lord and 1 foot in Baal, right? And you can even see that there in verse 21 of 1 Kings 18. Elijah came to all the people and said, how long will you falter between two opinions? The picture is you don't have both feet on the ground. You've got 1 foot leaning here, and then all of a sudden you got a 1 foot leaning over here. One in Baal, one in Yahweh. Why are you going back and forth with your opinions on who is the Lord? So let's have a showdown. Let's have you know the story. Fire comes down from Yahweh, burns it all up. This should make him happy. This should bring some godly confidence, for lack of a better term. But then you turn the chapter into 19, and he hears this. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. This is verse 1 of chapter 19. Also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, so let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he saw that, he arose and ran for his life, and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. He just witnessed a miracle. He just realized that Baal is not really a god. Prophets weren't really prophets. And then this Queen Jezebel, threatens his life by calling on her gods. And he runs for his life. Now, as you can see here, the response is what? Discouragement. You look at verse 4. He himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die. And what a difference from chapter 18 into chapter 19. Here's this great prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel, the boldness to go in front of all of Israel and taunting the prophets. Remember how he used to, where's your God? Where's the fire? Where is he? Maybe I don't know if you know the language there. He's taunting him with, hey, maybe he's at the toilet. Maybe he's busy in the loo. Maybe he's asleep. And you move from that Elijah to this Elijah. Look at verse 9. And there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? I love that, by the way. That's what you want to say to some people who are depressed. What are you doing? What are you doing? Why are you here? In many respects, why are you depressed? Once you find out why they're depressed, you have to bite your tongue to really rip into them and say, you're telling me you're all depressed because of that? Now, of course, being a biblical counselor, you want to be compassionate, so you don't always put it that way to them. But sometimes it's just silly how people become depressed. What are you doing here? Verse 10, so he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets. And I am alone left, and they seek to take my life. I'm it. You left me here all by myself. Woe is me. What was the expectation? Well, the expectation was, hey, Lord, look what all I did for you. Look, just up on Mount Carmel, look what I did for you, and this is how you thank me? How many of us have been in that situation? How many of us, have some spiritual victory, or we're out there evangelizing, or we're out there serving, and all of a sudden something comes, into your life which isn't pleasant, and your immediate reaction is, really? Thank you, Lord. Thank you for this. This is how you treat me. Is this how you treat the servants of your servants? What was the expectation? The expectation is that this doesn't happen to me. I'm a servant of God. Well, where does it say in the contract that this shouldn't happen to you? In the words of Jesus, are you better than your master? If he was treated as such, don't you think his disciples would be treated as such as well? And this is why it drives me mad, the whole prosperity gospel, right? That tells you you get saved, you're healthy and wealthy, and nothing bad will happen to you. They're lying to you, right? So it becomes wrong expectations. You say, what's the solution? Well, in Elijah's case, part of his problem was he was absolutely exhausted. And that's why the Lord gave him what? You notice in verses 5 through 7, he gave him food. He allowed him to sleep. In verse 11, he was assured of God's presence. But here's something else to take on board. The Lord gave him something to do. Notice that in verses 15 and 16. Go. Go. Return. Do something. This is what you want to tell the counselee. This is what you want to do yourself if you're depressed. This is why I say the book Spiritual Disciplines on the Christian Life is so helpful. Get busy. Do something. Get your eyes off yourself, get your eyes off your problem, and go serve someone else. Go do something else. Go. Very practical. In verse 18, yet, this is the Lord, I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Guess what? You aren't alone. You aren't the only prophet. I've got 7,000 more of you. Wrong thinking produces wrong behavior. Think on those things that are true. I'm helping somebody at the moment dealing with, you could say he's depressed, but one of the manifestations of it is suspicion, paranoia. He's suspicious of everything and everybody. So we sat down and talked about exactly what is your suspicion, and then we talked about biblical examples of suspicion. Remember King Saul? Right after they came from war, he heard the lady singing. Saul killed his 1,000, something like that, and David killed his 10,000s. Ooh, David's getting all the glory. Do I need to be suspicious of this guy? Well, I think I do. Everybody's singing his praises. Maybe he wants to be king. Maybe he's going to take over the throne. Saul, why are you suspicious of David? Based on what? Based on David and his actions? Or based on somebody singing David's praises? See how that works? See how your mind can just fly off the handle based on wrong thinking. On things you don't even know of. Not even true. And it'll drive you mad. Because it drove Saul mad. And I know plenty of people that go mad. Mad to the point, there was this guy in Adelaide that had similar issues, suspicion. And he would tell me that almost on the hour he would go to his house window and look down the street because he was certain people were watching him in a car. Or there was, as he get to work, he was, opening his drawers because he knew somewhere on his desk there was a wiretap. Who's watching you and why? Why would somebody tap your desk? Who? I mean, maybe you want to reason with them for a bit. Who? Who's after you? Nobody. It's in his head. But that's the problem. When you do not control your thinking, you will go mad. Even as Christians. And it'll spiral yourself down from disappointment to discouragement, downcast, despondency, depression, to a point where you despair. And the question is, despair over what? Despair over what? Not minimizing it, but that's the question, right? Why are you despairing? I mean, that's the question that the psalmist asks. Why are you in despair, O my soul? I have no reason to. We'll skip David, and we'll come back to some more examples in a moment. For now, these are the three big questions you need to ask, and I think you saw this last time. And this is the three big questions you ask with everybody. First of all, what is your problem? What does God say about your problem? 2. And 3, what does God say to do about your problem? Everybody clear on that? What is your problem? What does God say about your problem? And what does God say to do about your problem? Now, for today, for the rest of our time, we're really only going to answer question 1. Okay? And then we'll come back and answer the other 2 at another time. So what is your problem? Well, there could be a number of factors. Here's 13 things that are often associated with depression. Maybe you can relate to some of these. First of all, failure. Failure. According to some standard, we determined that we had not measured up. You feel like you're a failure. We fear that we're just ordinary. And I tell you, there's a lot of pressure today to be extraordinary. I mean, you got the books that come out, Radical, Crazy Love. You get all these fancy little titles that put the expectation that ordinary is not enough. That's why I love, Michael Horton wrote a book a few years ago that's basically said, whatever happened to being ordinary? Whatever happened to just being ordinary? Ordinary is good. Ordinary is fine. Kent Hughes, maybe you've read some of his books, commentaries. He wrote a very helpful book years ago called Liberating Ministry from the Success Syndrome. Because believe it or not, ministers get depressed all the time. One, because they either feel that they're failure, or the criticism that comes, or the expectations that people have that aren't met. In fact, I think I read some statistics that the 2 most likely candidates to be depressed are homemakers, women at home with their children, and ministers. Those were the top 2 categories. Okay? But here's Kent Hughes' testimony. He says, my gait, and I actually had to look that up. I've never heard that word before. It's a person's walk. Anybody heard that word before? A person's gait has lost his walk, his pattern, his steps, had lost its characteristic energy, and I often appeared downcast. Barbara knew, that's his wife, knew that it had to do with my work, for she observed that when things were going well at the church, I was okay, but otherwise I was discouraged. Church attendance was up, I was up. If it was down, so was I. And the numbers had been going down for a long time. So, ministers put that on themselves. Why is the numbers going? It must be something I'm doing. So you feel like a failure. Disappointment. We already talked about this, but here. Hope gradually erodes as disappointments mount. When you see nothing ahead of you in the future, there is no reason to get out of bed, love, or work. You come to a point in your life where you say, what's the point? What's the point? Depressed people, at some point, decide that they have had enough and they decide never to hope again. That's why I say the issue with depressed people is hope. They're hopeless. You need to give them hope. Hope, as it says here, is a key issue in depression. The critical transition is from hopeless to hopeful. They are living in darkness. They need some kind of light. I was sharing with the prayer meeting this morning, Psalm 13, I think it was, from David, where he basically says, Lord, enlighten my eyes because I'm living in darkness. And I was giving the example in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which is a great book, by the way, for biblical counselors, because as he, on his pilgrim to the celestial city, he deals with every potential, I don't want to say every, but most issues that Christians deal with. And when he comes to the valley of the shadow of death, that is on the heels of fighting Apollyon. Remember Apollyon is the devil? Symbolically the devil. And how did he fight Apollyon? He fought him with the sword of the Spirit. And he won. Kind of like Elijah. Spiritual victory. And then he walks through the valley of the shadow of death. And it's complete darkness. All he can hear, he hears horrible sounds, but he also hears a good sound that's way out in the distance, and that's ultimately going to be his friend Hopeful. But at the moment, he's walking in complete darkness. And it's interesting, Bunyan says, sword of the Spirit didn't work. I understand that. When you're completely depressed and in spiritual darkness, it's just black ink on white paper. I mean, you might have the Bible open, but you ain't reading anything. And Bunyan says the only thing that he used to get himself out of the valley of shadow of death was all prayer. I love that. All prayer. Like it was a weapon. All prayer. So the point is, all right, maybe you tell them to go home and read this chapter, and they just can't. Very minimum, because they're hopeless, is tell them to pull out all prayer. That's the only. That is when you're at rock bottom and you got to give them some hope. Cry out to God. That's what the psalmists do. They just cry out, help, help. And I'm all for it. By the way, I'm all for crying out to get help out of that situation. Sometimes the Lord leaves you in that situation because, you know what, there's lessons to be learned in the wilderness. There's lessons to be learned in the valley of shadow of death. And He'll pull you out when He wants you out after you've learned those lessons. But at the same time, I'm happy, and I think it's okay, get me out of here. I think that would be a natural cry. But you should have to wait on the Lord. How many times the psalmist says, but I wait, and I wait, and I wait. So failure, disappointment, sadness, and anger. Look at Psalm 6 there. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am pining away. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are dismayed. I am weary with my sighing every night. I make my bed swim. I dissolve my couch with tears. My eye has wasted away with grief. Here's the depressed guy. Ken Hughes again says, my depression itself had become increasingly ugly. A covert, unarticulated animosity had crept through my soul. It was hidden from all. Years of honestly cultivating Christian civility served me well, for inside I was a very angry man. And this is telling. He says, the focus of my resentment was God Himself, the one who had called me to this. I had given everything, all my time, all my education, years of ministry, and true Christian devotion. He knew. And now I was failing. God was to blame. As we saw with Cain, anger is an issue that involves depression. In fact, Welch's formula here is sadness plus anger equals depression. Isn't that interesting? I think that's right. Sadness along with anger will lead to depression. Welch also says the wisest way to approach this subject is to assume that you are angry. Now you say, no, I'm depressed. Well, underneath all of that is you're angry. That's why you're depressed. You might be angry at a particular person. You might be angry at the particular issue and circumstance. But ultimately, you're angry with God. And you have to be honest with yourself about that. Fear. Let's keep moving here. Fear. When depression is at its most severe, paranoia, suspicion, or I should say paranoia or suspicion is one of its cardinal features. It's fear run amok. You can feel as if both you and your world are falling apart and you are certain there's nothing you can do about it. Loneliness. You can look up, for the sake of time, look up Psalm 31:9 and verses 11 and 12. But sure, lonely. You feel lonely? No friend? I mean, that's what Elijah says. I'm the only one. Ken Hughes here says, except for my wife, it seemed that no one cared. Now, again, stop there. Is that true? That's how you feel, but is that true? I don't feel like anybody cares anymore. Now, do you know that no one cares? Or do you feel that no one cares? Well, I feel that no one cares. But it's not true, because there are a lot of people that do care, right? Well, okay, yeah. I mean, your mom cares, right? Your mom's supposed to care. So you got your mom. Maybe your dad, maybe your brother, maybe your sister. Maybe your husband, maybe your wife, your children. So that's wrong. You can't say that no one cares. You getting my point? Lack of enthusiasm and passiveness. Welch says, probably the most obvious challenge posed by depressed people is their apparent lack of passion or enthusiasm for anything. I mean, you have no joy, you have no zeal, you have no energy. You're just a blob. Depression says surrender. I give up. The message is relentless, and many comply because even when you know that there is a purpose to your suffering, the battle seems too long. I mean, we could tell you, all things work together for good, right? All the bad things, all the good things, and they're working together for good, for your good and for God's glory. And we all know that verse. But in the midst of it all, there's a sense where you don't really care. Get me out of this. Instead of waiting on the Lord, having Him deal with you the way that He wants to deal with you. Can I say this? The mark of a mature Christian versus the mark of an immature Christian, and I think I mentioned it earlier, or at least you hear it in the Psalms, and that is talk to yourself rather than listen to yourself. Does that make sense? If you listen to yourself, woe is me, nobody cares, I'm such a failure, and you just start heaping all of that on you, you are going to spiral down. Or talk to yourself. I'm a Christian. I'm a child of God. I know that God works all things together for good, for His glory. I know that this trial is in my life to refine me because I want to be perfect, mature. I mean, that's what James says. Consider it all joy when you encounter various trials for the perfection of your faith, so that no man is lacking. I mean, if you need wisdom on why God's bringing this trial, is this a trial like any other trial, or is God chastening you? Well, ask God wisdom, and He will give to every man generously. But my point is, most Christians do not, and this is where we need to help, and we can even help in such a class. Most Christians don't understand the purpose of trials in their life. They've been told that, it's like the pagan idea. Well, if a trial comes in your life, it's because the gods are angry with you, right? That's ancient history. The reason why trouble comes in your life, I mean, that was Job's friends, right? Job, search your life. You must have sinned against God. And Job, in all the rounds of discussion, says, I'm not a perfect guy, but I have made a covenant with mine that I will look upon virgins, and I do help the poor and the needy, and I do this and I do that. My conscience is clear. I can't think of anything. But my point is, the friends had that pagan idea. You must have done something. There must be some kind of hidden sin with you, Job. And most people think that too today. You need to understand the purpose of trials. Trials have a refining characteristic. It pulls out the junk in you, the dross in you. Makes you more Christ-like. It weans you from the world. It makes you dependent upon God. It drives you to the Word and to your knees. I mean, think of all the good. Think of all the trials in your life where you hated it, but once you got out of it, you look back and you go, you know what? I wouldn't have traded that time for anything. Look how close I was to the Lord. Look how much reading I did and how much praying I did. And you can react that way, or you can just get angry with God and say, stuff it all. And then you'll be depressed. Go to page 7. Meaningless. The perceived meaninglessness of work is often a part of depression. It usually, however, is a sign of depression rather than a cause. Again, it's similar to some of these other points. What's the point? It all seems meaningless. I mean, you remember Solomon was wrestling with that. I mean, I work all day and I worked all my life, and then at the end of my life, I turn around and give it to somebody. How do I know if he's going to take care of it? Maybe it's all meaningless. Vanity of vanities, it's all vanity. You got to wrestle with all that. Is life meaningless? Is your work meaningless? Is you being a husband meaningless, or a wife meaningless, or a father or mother? You at work, is that meaningless? We're all called by God to serve, and we serve in the church, but we serve in the world. We're here to be light. We're here as evangelists. You have meaning, even if it's just that. Just a few more here. Inward focus, fatigue. I mentioned about fatigue. Neglect of life responsibilities. There was a guy in our church a few years ago who was, there's ever such thing as clinical depression. This guy was clinically depressed. Driven by his anxieties, driven by his fears. He was married, didn't have any kids. He ended up living in his car, wasn't working, lost heaps of weight, looked horrible. You could just talk about countenance. And you come alongside and we try to talk about the issues, and he couldn't even articulate them. But after a while you say, but okay, you do have responsibilities, you know. You are the man of the home, and you are a husband. You do have to provide for your family. You do have to go to work. I know you're down and we're trying to help you with all your issues, but in the midst of trying to help you, you still have to fulfill your responsibilities. And when you get to a point where you just don't feel like doing that, then you're, again, like I said, it's about as clinically depressed as you can get. I tell you else what will make you depressed is unconfessed sin. Unconfessed sin. There's a couple verses there for that. Psalm 31, Psalm 38. And then I think this is the last one. Wrong views of God. By the way, on the unconfessed sin, people know that they do things wrong and they feel guilty, which will make them depressed. So they go to the doctor. I'm depressed. The psychiatrist and psychologist's job as an industry is to let you know that you aren't responsible for your problems. In other words, remove the guilt. They try to help remove the guilt by saying it's not your fault, by saying it's not your problem. And thus, what's the solution? Well, take a pill. It'll make you feel better. So you're masking the whole thing. You're not dealing with the guilt, and you're not really even dealing with the issue because they've given you a pill. And look, pills help, right? Pills make you feel better. But it hasn't dealt with the issue. Hasn't dealt with the problem. At best, it's a Band-Aid. And if one of the issues is guilt and unconfessed sin, I mean, think of David. What did he say in Psalm 32? My body was wasting away. My bones were just shriveling up until what? I confessed. Until once he confessed, it was like that proverbial dam that was holding up all the water, and he confessed, and the dam broke, and all the water went through. Confession. Confession of sin. Lastly, wrong views of God. Notice what Welch says here. Things don't simply happen to us. When they do, we respond with an immediate interpretation of their meaning and significance. We filter the events through our view of God. This is why it's so important that you have a right view of God. Study the character of God. Know God. As he says here, keep probing. Life is ultimately about God. There are times when we put our trust in a person and what we can get from that person rather than putting our trust in Christ and loving others. Once again, it comes down to spiritual allegiances. Like the ancient idolaters, we have said that God is not enough. And then he says, dashed hope, or dashed hopes, can lead to frustration with God. Frustration with God leads to self-imposed spiritual isolation or withdrawal, and spiritual isolation leads to self-pity. I understand that. Do you understand that? Most of us have been here. Thankfully, get out of it, but for a moment or for weeks, if not months, we're there. What are your expectations? Because if they're not fulfilled, you're going to get disappointed. Disappointment leads to discouragement. Discouragement leads to downcast accounts, leads to despondency, and then down to depression and despair. Solomon has some more things to say here. From Ecclesiastes, Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes to help us deal with the frustration of living in a Genesis 3 sin-cursed world. Therefore, Ecclesiastes identifies many things that lead to discouragement and potentially depression. Remember, if you ever studied the book of Ecclesiastes, I mean, what does he mean by vanity of vanities, all his vanities? Is he saying life is just useless? I don't think that's what he's saying there. Because we've already said there's purpose to life. I think what he's saying is trying to figure out everything that life brings in terms of understanding it all. You're gonna be, well, it's like chasing wind. It's going to be like, you can't figure out everything. And so for 11 chapters, he explores the world, he explores pleasure, he explores education, he explores this, he explores that, just to say if there's any, is there any purpose, any meaning, is trying to pull it all together. And in the end, he says, look, I haven't figured it all out, but this thing I know. Remember your Creator in the day of youth, because when it all comes and says and done, he's going to bring everything to his judgment. That I know. I don't know a lot of things, but that I know. And the ultimate point here is know your God. Know that. Know that. So anyway, just almost done here. A lot more we could say, but that's under the question, what is your problem? Somebody walks in and says, what's your problem? He says, I'm depressed. Of course you're depressed. You feel horrible. You feel miserable. Let's start talking about why you're depressed. And there's 13 things that are potential reasons why they are depressed. Remember I said there could be reasons, but at the end of the day, there's no excuse. And I'm not being harsh when I'm saying that. I hope you're hearing me being compassionate. I've been there. One of the great things of being a Christian, can I say in ministry, is because I've been through the ringer where I can come along somebody and say, I've been there. And that's okay. God's grace is sufficient. Keep going. Pick yourself up and keep going. Let's wrap it up just with about 15 minutes with two examples. Let's kind of began with a couple examples. Let's finish with a couple examples. First is Paul. Let's see how these two, Paul and Jeremiah, dealt with, you could say, depression. Here's some help. All right? In 2 Corinthians. Now, this is Paul's second letter, at least second of 4. I don't know if you know that. If you read in between the lines of everything he says in 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, there was at least 4 letters written to the church in Corinth. We only have the 2 here. And if you know anything about the Corinth church, they have broken Paul's heart. You get that certainly in the first letter. And he's defending himself as an apostle. He's dealing with the pride, the disunity in the church, dealing with specific issues as well. And as a result, he's struggling. Certainly when you come to 2 Corinthians, you can see that he's struggling. He's struggling with despair. He's struggling with sorrow. He's struggling with conflict. What does he do? Well, over in chapter 4, look at verse 1. This is a verse I have had to often come to a number of times. Therefore, since we have this ministry, as we have received mercy, we do not lose heart. Now, if you go back to chapter 3, there's a long discussion between the difference between the ministry of death, which was the old covenant, and the ministry of life, which is the new covenant. And he's making a comparison. It's almost like the book of Hebrews. Why would you want to go back to a ministry of death? But that was the old covenant. It was written on stone. The new covenant is written on the heart. And Paul's recognizing, I'm a minister of the new covenant. Since we have such a ministry. In other words, in chapter 2, chapter 3, he is miserable. But as he comes into chapter 4, there's a change. And what is the change? He recognizes that it's enough to wear the uniform that says Jesus Christ on the back. What a privilege. What a privilege just to be a minister of the new covenant. It's enough that I've attained mercy. I mean, how you walk through, and this is another homework assignment, go through Paul's letters and notice how many times he just says, be thankful. Or he says himself, I'm thankful. And he can't get over it. I was a blasphemer, I was a persecutor of the church, and I received mercy. What do I have to complain about? What do I have to get down about? Nothing. It's enough that I am wearing a uniform on my back that says Jesus Christ. I'm on his team. Now, you can read the rest of the points there, but those are the solutions. I mean, chapter 5, verse 9, it's our noble ambition to what? Please the Lord. We make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to him. The text I really wanted to wrap it up with is Jeremiah, because this is one of my favorite texts when we discuss depression, as it were. And I did want to get this in case you didn't come back to hear the other talks. But turn to Lamentations. We'll wrap it up here. Lamentations is written by Jeremiah. Now, you can hear lament in Lamentations. This is a lament. You say, what is he lamenting about? What is he pining about? What is he sad about? Well, the verse 1 tells you how lonely sits the city that was full of people. Remember, Jeremiah was a prophet that led right up to the Babylonian exile. He kept saying, repent or it's coming, repent or it's coming. Well, here it is. And remember, Nebuchadnezzar took 3 rounds to get all the people out to Babylon. He came in 605, and then he came in 597, and then he came in 586, and in 586, he basically says enough, and he's leveled the city. In 605 and 597, he left some of the people there with a king and thought, well, okay, we'll have a king over these people. We'll take most of them. I mean, remember, Babylonian foreign policy was once they besieged a city, they would take those people and put them over here, and the city over here that they besieged, take those people and move them over here. Remember up in Samaria, up in the northern kingdom, Israel, there was this half-breed, half Jewish, half foreign, and they became the Samaritans. Remember this whole, John 4, Samaritan woman, and why that was kind of a unique thing. But that was Babylonian foreign policy, for lack of a better way of putting it. Didn't take everybody, though. They put up a puppet king there in Israel. But the puppet king rebelled until Nebuchadnezzar said in 586, 587, enough is enough. And he leveled the city. And this is Jeremiah writing about it. He has reason to be sad. In fact, if you go over to Jeremiah, Lamentations, verse 16 of chapter 1. For these things I weep. My eye overflows with water, because the Comforter who should restore my life is far from me. My children are desolate because the enemy prevailed. There's a little bit of window into Jeremiah. Come into chapter 2. Notice how Jeremiah puts... Now, let me say it this way. Jeremiah is telling us how he feels, but in telling us how he feels, notice who he's ultimately pointing the finger at. I think that's the way I want to put it. So in Jeremiah 2, verse 2. Let's start with verse 1. How the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger. He cast down from heaven to the earth the beauty of Israel and did not remember his footstool in the day of his anger. Verse 2, the Lord has swallowed up and has not pitied. He has thrown down in his wrath. He has brought them down to the ground. He has profaned the kingdom of his prince. He has cut off in his fierce anger. Verse 4, standing like an enemy, he has bent his bow. Verse 5, the Lord was like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. Verse 6, he has done violence to his tabernacle. Verse 7, he has spurned his altar. Verse 8, the Lord has purpose to destroy. And then you come to verse 11. My eyes fail with tears, my heart is troubled, my bile is poured on the ground because of the destruction of the daughter of my people, because the children and the infants faint in the streets of the city. And you get the picture. There's destruction, there's death, there's exile. A lot of reasons to be depressed. Not minimizing this at all. Come into chapter 3, notice verse 1. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He has led me and made me walk in darkness and not in light. Surely he has turned his hand against me. Time and time again throughout the day, he has aged my flesh and my skin and broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and woe. He has set me in dark places like the dead of long ago. Again, who's he pointing the finger at? Verse 7, he has hedged me in so that I cannot get out. He has made my chain heavy. Even when I cry and shout, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with hewn stone. He has made my paths crooked. He has been to me a bear lying in wait like a lion in ambush. He has turned aside my ways and torn me in pieces. He has made me desolate. He has made his bow bent. He has set me up as a target of his arrow. He has caused the arrows of his quiver to pierce my loins. I have become the ridicule of all my people, their taunting song all the day. He has filled me with bitterness. He has made me drink wormwood. He has also, verse 16, broken my teeth with gravel and covered me with ashes. You have moved my soul far from peace. I've gotten prosperity. Notice the he went to a you. And I said, my strength and my hope have perished from the Lord. There he is. I'm depressed. Because, look, you've been a bear. You've been a lion. You have done this and hedged me here. My body's wasting away. You don't hear my prayer. I describe Lamentations 3, up to this point I just read for you. I describe this is how Jeremiah feels. Got that? Now, one of the key verses in all of this is in verse 20 and 21. My soul still remembers and sinks within me. And here's the turning point with Jeremiah. And this is where anybody that's depressed needs to turn. And that is, this I recall to my mind, therefore what? I have hope. It's going to have to be in the changing of thinking if anybody's going to have hope. You've got to change their thinking. Now, in particular, what does Jeremiah say? Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I have hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should hope and wait quietly. Notice the language of hope there. For the salvation of the Lord. And you go to page 11, and you notice what the solution is. Amidst all the feeling and all the pain, not to minimizing it, but you have to come to a point where you recall to your mind, and thus you have hope. And in a word, your hope is what? Theological. Jeremiah found relief in the person of God. When he comes down to verse 24, the Lord is my portion, therefore I have hope in him. And as you can see, he mentions God's unfailing love. He mentions God's faithfulness, his compassion, his goodness, his sovereignty, his justice, his nearness. Right thinking produces right behavior. Wrong thinking produces wrong behavior. I picked up some time ago sermons on Jeremiah's Lamentations by a Puritan by the name of David Dixon. And I just pulled it off knowing that we were going to look at Lamentations 3. Let me just read something here that I think is so helpful. He says in the 21st verse, which is the one that says, "This I recall to mind, therefore I have hope." In the 21st verse, Dixon says, Jeremiah cast his eye on God with whom he had to do and consider the nature of God. He says that he conceived some hope when he calls to mind his own weakness under affliction, God's merciful disposition and readiness to remember. There he has hope. And before he comes to this, listen, he has had great wrestling, which lets us see that God's children under any grief win not to a hope of a deliverance without great wrestling. And I think that's what most Christians don't realize. They don't understand it's going to be a struggle. It is going to be a fight. It is going to be a wrestling. He says wrestling has still been the exercise of the saints. And he mentions David, he mentions Hezekiah, Isaiah, and of course Isaiah. As victors, he says, resolve to fight against infidelity, against your own corrupt nature, against the evil world and the profane who scoff at the comforts and the crosses of the godly, against the devil who would drive you to despair and make you suspect God and his kingdom kindness and carry ill tales of God to you and slander his grace in you so that you can never be free of his suggestions and temptations. Resolve then, he says, to be wrestlers. Else think not to enjoy God's behavior. Therefore, learn to handle your weapons. Take the shield of faith above all. Jeremiah wrestled. He had to get hope in his head, and so he wrestled for it. He also says this, when our eyes are open to see our deservings and compare God's dealings with our deserving, then complaints will cease, then will fretting and impatience be laid aside, and we will be patient and humble before the Lord. By the way, go down to verse 39 of Lamentations 3. Why should a living man complain, a man for the punishment of his sins? What is he saying? You can't complain, you're a sinner. You have no reason to complain. And you have no right to complain. You're a sinner. Last thing I'll just read for you. I thought this was helpful. On verse 24, the Lord is my portion. He says, now at last, Jeremiah draws nearer to God and pulls him in his arms and says, thou are my portion. Mark here the degrees of a soul drawing near to God. In unbelief, the back is on God and the face toward hell. But when a soul begins to believe or think upon God, it conceives hope. And having meditated a while on his nature, it turns and speaks to him. At last it embraces him and says, thou art my portion. Jeremiah, who lately was calling God a lion or a bear in the archer, but is now calling God his portion, should you not do likewise? Wrestle, and you shall find victory. I thought that was good. Again, do we understand that we need to wrestle, that we need to struggle, that we need to fight? Disappointments will come. Trials will come. How do you respond? That's the question. If you don't respond rightly, you may well spiral down into depression. And if you do, learn from Lamentations, learn from Jeremiah. The way out of it is to meditate on the character of God, wrestle with God. Recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. The Lord is my portion. Does that make sense? And look, it's easier said than done. I always preach a better sermon than I practice. But it takes work. That's the beauty of a church. We are our brother's keeper. We are here to admonish one another. We are here to encourage one another. This is why sometimes I call biblical counseling discipleship. Because you want somebody older than you that's gone through all this that can come alongside. I've been there. And yes, it's painful. Yes, it's not pleasant, but the grace of God is sufficient. Understanding the nature of God, understanding the purpose of trials, understand that it begins with right thinking. Just some helpful things just to begin with. We'll say a lot more when we come back. Now, speaking of, before we wrap up, we're not going to meet next week. I forgot that I'm away in Canberra next Sunday. So, no class next Sunday. The following Sunday is the 29th, which is the lunch and the 3 p.m. service. So, guess what? For the 3 p.m. service sermon, we're going to do part 2 of depression. So everybody gets in on this. Everybody's miserable, not just you. Okay? So, just a heads up on that. So, not next Sunday, but the Sunday after. And then the following Sundays, I'm free. So, we'll just pick it up from there. But sorry about that. The timing's horrible, I know. But yeah, I'm off to Canberra next Sunday. Right on the nose, 4:30. Time's up. Let me close in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you again for your kindness in that you have not left us without knowing your will, knowing your character, knowing how to deal with life's issues. You've given us your word. You've given us your spirit. You've given us the church and each other. Father, forgive us for wrong thinking and wrong behavior. Forgive us for acting almost like a child at times, selfishly, complaining. And we have no business complaining. We have, like the psalmist says, no reason to despair. Thank you that you do deal with us as children, that you know our frailty, you know we're but dust. May we deal with each other in the same manner, compassionate, loving, restoring, helping each other up, especially in those times when we do get down. Amen.